Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brad Hairston with SS&C Blue Prism. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Today, I'm happy to have as my guest Dr. Federico Berruti, a partner at McKinsey who is based in Toronto. Federico and I will be talking about how companies can effectively manage the risk and returns of intelligent automation. Federico, welcome to the podcast. Please tell our listeners more about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Brad. So as mentioned, I'm Federico Berruti. I'm a partner based out of Toronto. I work in McKinsey's automation practice, and I helped found our practice about a decade ago. And a lot of work with clients on what we call digital service operations and transformations in this regard. So I serve a lot of financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, wealth players, but also across sectors and in functions on these types of transformations involving automation and AI. So delighted to be here.
Excellent. And Federico, I noticed that you have a PhD in chemical engineering and renewable technologies. How does someone go from that to being an automation expert in the financial services industry?
Great question. It's funny, when we were doing a lot of work in chemical engineering and processes that involve chemical engineering, we had to do a lot of, modeling and automation of those processes themselves. And so there's a lot of process controls and elements that go along with that and different types of coding. And then through quite a journey at McKinsey and learning how this applies in other sectors, it really picked up a lot of pace during the time that I've been here. And it's become a core part of what I do in automation and AI. So very excited to connect those dots and bring this to clients in a wild way.
So Federico, at the end of last year, you and some of your colleagues at McKinsey published an article that was titled Managing the Risk and Returns of Intelligent Automation. It was a really great piece, and it definitely caught my attention because there hasn't been that much written in general on risk management in the automation space. So I really found it intriguing. What prompted you and your colleagues to share your point of view on this topic?
What stemmed this is that we find ourselves at a bit of a turning point in automation and AI. In the last couple of years with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a drive that really pushed automation and AI adoption into overdrive. And with a bunch of our clients, we conducted many surveys of top executives around the world, and more than 2/3 of their companies say that they accelerated their adoption of automation and AI and digital more broadly during the crisis. And some have even gone as far as to say that COVID-19 was AI's before and after moment in a way because of how it accelerated. And some of the estimates show that it accelerated things 7 years on average globally on a development basis in just a matter of 1 or 2 years. And specifically, as we were looking at the institutions and clients, so in banks and insurance companies, many large corporates deploying automation AI, which we generally refer to as intelligent automation, we see them optimizing a bunch of end-to-end processes and automating not just tactical activities to achieve efficiencies and effectiveness, but even more complex strategic prediction problems to enhance decision-making. And when that starts to happen in that moment in time, as adoption significantly increases, you need to start to think about not just the returns, but also the risks associated with those decisions. And can the executives and can the companies have a full picture on what they're embarking on? Can they explain those things to regulators? Can the general public understand where and how we're using automation and AI? And all of those elements pushed in the direction of what we were seeing as best practice around these elements, which spawned the article to come out.
Interesting. And why is it so important to talk to both the risk and the returns together? You obviously could have directed this article at either one of those and it still would have held its own, but why did you do it on both of those together?
Great question. I mean, if left unmanaged, the risks start to erode the ROI from intelligent automation so quickly, which in turn quickly does things like reduce employee trust in the transformation and the technologies themselves. And there's a ripple effect from there. There's this increasing scrutiny from regulators on how decisions are being made. And many institutions are quickly having to actually create a pretty clear heat map of their automation and AI models to truly understand the risks that exist therein. It's almost kind of model risk management of the future, if you will. And so to truly drive strategic decisions and importantly adoption across organizations, leaders, we feel, have to take a pretty holistic view on these things of both the benefits and risks together. And especially since a lot of these tools are starting to touch very critical business processes. So it's looking a little bit beyond the hype of the next new thing, but to ensure that systematically as these things get rolled out, you really have a balanced approach and that it's driving value, but you're managing the inherent risks as well.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. As companies have begun to adopt automation and AI at a more aggressive pace, as you mentioned, COVID certainly has accelerated everything. What are some of the new risks that they're now having to deal with as a result of really ramping up these platforms?
Yeah, there are a lot of them. There's many sources of automation and AI risks, but here, I'll list a few that we've seen as most important to our clients.
Okay.
One is potential breaches of data privacy rules in development models. Obviously, things like that can create quite a ripple effect. There's can be a lack of transparency around how the intelligent automation systems work. So with the risks and flaws that might be in those models or in the training data itself that may introduce errors or unfairness or bias in how decisions are made. We've seen some of those things on videos and things like that of different types of biases that can be quite unwelcomed. Then, of course, there could be new cybersecurity risks, such as model extraction or deliberate data poisoning by bad actors or third parties, cyber attacks that then kind of poison data that is used for automation, which could create problems. And overall, just increased third-party risks as these tools and technologies could ultimately affect the delivery of something that is a critical business service, not only for the client itself, but for the surrounding ecosystem of a client. And those can be quite important. So people, when you think of banking and financial institutions in particular, if a bank isn't able to do payments on one day or something like that because of something that went down, that could create quite a ripple effect. And so those critical business services need to be very carefully monitored.
Yeah, absolutely. So Federico, what are the steps that McKinsey recommends to companies to really get their arms around this, to manage risk and returns more effectively? Could you kind of walk us through the approach that you guys put in front of your clients?
Absolutely. So, in the article, we described 5 steps. So I'll step you through each one of these a little bit as we discuss. But
okay.
The first step is to establish what we call a dedicated automation and AI risk return center of excellence. You can call it whatever you want. That's a mouthful, but essentially it's meant to ensure that the intelligent automation solutions drive performance and value across business processes and within risk limits. And many institutions already stand up some kind of center of excellence or a COE for just the development and execution of automation and AI. And this can be joint with that. It can join with those transformation offices and with a clear risk linkage to it centrally.
Right.
It's a little bit of the first step.
Okay.
And then basically, as you start to think about that, the COE would go and collaborate with other risk functions to draw on the full suite of risk capabilities that exist in the business. And so good examples of this in banking, model risk management of the future type concepts typically provide a view on AI vulnerabilities, such as they relate to fairness or bias that we talked about. So essentially trying to really show the explainability of the models. If you have a deep learning algorithm that was used to decide something, what were the actual drivers that were used to decide if this person would get a mortgage versus this one, right? And we have to explain those things and work back on those AI models. And the COE would then play a strategic role to coordinate those activities performed by the model risk management function and other functions like legal, compliance, IT, and get the full picture kind of holistically to be reported back. Since they're working with these functions, as mentioned, like legal and compliance and others, the step is to really identify and prioritize an enterprise-wide inventory of the opportunities for end-to-end optimization and business simplification and use that as the backbone, right? And so then that common language with every function or every part of the business to define what part of the work that we do are we talking about where these models apply. And so typically organizations may already be using AI and automation applications. So the creation of a robust inventory is that fundamental task for the COE, right? To start to coordinate with the other functions, then to collect the information like, the implementation platform, the business processes in question, the owner of the system, and who are like the folks that make changes to it, any associated technology vendors and potential vulnerabilities identified with the approach, et cetera. And this inventory would then be continuously updated and maintained by the COE. And ideally, a cadence has been established for the business units or the functions to submit this information more proactively or even in an automated way, so that every automation application is implemented that way and you get a feedback loop of this heat map.
Okay. So this enterprise-wide inventory of opportunities that you just talked about, what strategic purpose would this serve for leaders? Could you touch on that?
Yeah. So the inventory helps the leaders identify opportunities to replicate or expand approaches that are working well and that could be leveraged by other areas at the same time across the enterprise, but also to spot risks proactively and try to mitigate them and then take those learnings and take them to other places as well. So it enables sort of strategic decision-making when it comes to where to deploy and enhance or even retire or consolidate technologies, right? As things move down the road. And just back to like our list, the third step at this point is really to build a standard technology integration framework for selection, development, and deployment of potential AI and automation solutions. So in practice, the COE establishes a standard process and a set of principles for the development and implementation of these AI and automation technologies. It becomes a bit of a playbook, right, of how you do this. And it then works directly with the business units across the organization to make sure that playbook is being used systematically and consistently. And doing this not only increases the transparency around this framework, but ensures that the risks start to get captured and the limitations are identified early and all those learnings are shared. And so this kind of then steps into kind of one of our final steps, right, is that the COE starts to then truly assess those AI and automation risks. Every AI and automation tool needs to undergo this rigorous testing that encompasses data quality, performance, sensitivity in the system, explainability of the model. And these tests are then, important in order to identify potential inaccuracies or biases.
Okay, so just to recap what you've talked about so far, establish an automation and AI risk return COE, assemble an enterprise-wide inventory of opportunities, build a standard technology integration framework, and assess AI and automation risk. Take us to the final step, if you will, that you recommend to companies in terms of how to manage risk and returns more effectively.
Yeah, the final kicker, right, is actually being able to design the framework for this risk return model and monitoring so that there's well-defined performance and risk indicators. So we've seen this approach used widely now in the banking sector, especially in certain geographies versus others. And in many cases, the monitoring has been like limited to risks, right? They're like really focused on the risks. We believe that to truly drive strategic decision-making, these monitoring dashboards would need to be enhanced to provide both the risk and return benefit to make better decisions around these types of deployment with solution-specific information like the level of benefit observed over a specific period of time and any performance or efficiency deterioration. And so you start to get into kind of a systematic cadence at that point with like a real blueprint across the entire organization that flashes red, yellow, green based on like, hey, here are models with higher risks, higher vulnerabilities. Here's where we're developing. Here's where we're designing. And so you start to really have a view of where we're going with the organization and your process journeys of the future, if you will.
Okay. Federico, many organizations that create COEs around intelligent automation, as you know, they put them in the IT organization, regardless of where the sponsorship for the automation program came from. When you talk about the robust monitoring of both the risk and returns of IA, that sounds very different from the typical IT run COE. Could you expand on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think more and more, even beyond kind of IT run center of excellences, we're seeing joint IT and ops or with the business types of center of excellence, because these automation AI COEs need to be close to the processes and the work that inherently are being driven by the business, and that decision making that is really business oriented, with of course clear support from IT and technology, but it becomes more and more cross-functional, if you will. So now when you add this layer to it, it really comes down to the ultimate goal of the intelligent automation risk return COE. It needs to be a central function. It's responsible for ensuring that you're driving performance across the business processes, but without increasing the risk beyond the organization's limits. And to be successful, it should include leaders that are quite cross-functional in this regard as well. So not just IT and not just business and the ops, but it'll need to include risk and other enabling functions that we discussed around compliance and legal and others potentially to drive strategic value at scale.
Thank you for clarifying. And thank you for walking us through your recommended steps for companies. What are some of the challenges that you see that organizations face when implementing this approach? I'm sure they are not all equipped to follow your recommendations exactly as you've laid them out. And then what can business leaders do to mitigate these pitfalls?
Yeah, so tactically, most organizations don't yet have the appropriate structures and tools to effectively roll out intelligent automation by itself. Yet again, thinking about also then managing the infrastructure around risks and returns in a more holistic fashion. So there's, a learning curve that's obviously being accelerated, but, that there's a lot of work to be done in this space. Specifically, I think different aspects of the system development and operation, such as the implementation and the systems management, the risk and resilience management, how you think about operational resilience, and bringing these programs a little bit together around efficiency enhancement and resilience and optimization all start to become one thing, right? And it's around business simplification, it's around intelligent automation, and it's around managing risks, efficiencies, and returns. And it's often in so many places managed by so many various functions separately in silos or in fragmented ways. And so there's a bunch of steps in the operating model that'll be important to start to, get towards impact, but also get towards the right kind of operating model that helps an organization do this. So you need to stand up some robust frameworks around this, the processes, the infrastructure, and you have to incorporate the automation specific considerations on some of this. It's not the same as, just thinking about lean in the past or those types of elements. Then there's all these extra layers of complexity introduced from AI and digital risk management processes. So from a strategic lens, like the biggest challenge businesses encounter is adoption and this operating model change. And to mitigate this, executives should ensure that there's a well-defined change management model that also really speaks to the culture of the organization and the change story for the organization and its employees, its customers, and its leaders all together. And think about how to roll out that approach with a clear plan that's top-down communication, it's multi-tier from frontline training. There's a clear kind of systematic roadmap to get there. And obviously with a lot of feedback along the way, because it's not something you flip the switch on in a big bang. It takes some time to start to roll that out and build those strategic capabilities.
Interesting. Federico, at what point in companies' intelligent automation maturity does it make the most sense to address risk and return management? Is it just for those that are well down the road and have really scaled their automation capability? Or do you think it's something that should be addressed even as they begin?
I think originally when clients started to do this type of work, we could call it sort of 5 years ago when it really started to pick up, the mandate was really around test and learn and pilot. Some entered pilot purgatory as they ran a lot of experiments and getting into impact and starting to learn and build the capability. And those players that were ahead, I think then learned about more of these kind of risk and return questions later, and then started to be like, oh, we've had the realization that they should embed that into the program. I think now, with that awareness, clients are at earlier stages of maturity and in their journey are starting to take advantage of that. Well, learning as kind of fast followers to make sure they embed those best practices now. And obviously they're already playing catch up on intelligent automation. If they're at that stage of maturity now, you need to be planning in advance for that. And so we recommend starting to think about risks and returns holistically on these programs from the get-go and have cross-functional teams looking at this from the beginning.
Excellent. Federico, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and sharing your thoughts and insights. You've given our listeners a lot of great food for thought, especially on this risk management topic, which, as we discussed, just doesn't get covered enough. So thank you again, and I wish you the best.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.